So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are now and when you're listening to this. And greetings from the International Gender Champions Impact Groups. We can take the screen off, I think, the slide off. Hello, there I am with all the wonderful co-chairs of the IGC Impact Groups. So as you know, we're celebrating our 5-year anniversary this week. It happens to be July 1st, the actual anniversary. So we are doing this webinar on the actual day of the 5-year anniversary, celebrating all the work that we've done in impact in particular. We're going to have a brief intro. We'll have conversations with each of the chairs of the impact groups, and then we'll open up for discussion with those of you online. So we're hoping to have a very exciting hour and a half. I'm your moderator, Caitlin Kraft-Buchman. I'm the CEO founder of Women at the Table, which is a civil society organization based here in international Geneva, dedicated to systems change. I'm also one of the 3 co-founders of the International Gender Champions and still serve on the global board. When we founded, we were the International Geneva Gender Champions as a network 5 years ago as female and male decision makers dedicated to breaking down gender barriers and systems change for international organizations, member states, and civil society, all as equal partners, all equally dedicated to making gender equality happen. As one of the very few leaders who are here with us that very first day that are still on their posts, which is a very normal cycle of diplomatic movement, as is witnessed by Sally Work-Zedeh, who is now the president, our former colleague, Sally Work-Zedeh, now president of Ethiopia, Kangwa Kang, who's now Minister of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Korea, and of course our former IGC board chair, Arantxa Gonzalez, the Foreign Minister of Spain. I'm the only co-founder who remains, but I do want to shout out, of course, to our colleagues, Pamela Hamamoto, US Ambassador to Geneva, and Michael Mueller, our co-founders, and those who are with us that very first day and remain with us, including Peter Maurer of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, who gave a very impassioned and very spontaneous speech that first day about bringing along the Federation and the entire Red Cross movement, and he's kept true to his word, as have many of you, all of you who have joined us along the way and really done some spectacular work with your commitments. So at that launch, shortly thereafter, everybody promised, as they do now, to do the No More Sim single-sex panel pledge and make 2 commitments for their organizations in programmatic work or gender work for gender equality into their organizations. And we divided all those commitments into roughly 4 groups, and we met over a course of a year, talking a lot about our mutual goals, but we realized very shortly that without real political will and political commitment and leadership from the very, very top, we would have only brilliant conversations and not a lot of impact. So the impact groups were born late in 2016 and became operationalized in January 2017. And the first 2 of those groups were health and trade, and we're going to hear a lot about trade in a minute, but the health group gathered champion members of the WHO Executive Board to highlight a leadership gap in global health. They wrote an editorial that was published in The Lancet. They gathered their champions who were members of the executive board to sign a declaration that came from the editorial in The Lancet. And this provoked all of the candidates, the many candidates for WHO DG, to put gender equality, gender parity, movement towards this and global health as part of their candidate statements. And indeed, our leader, who is a champion with us, Dr. Tedros, has remained very, very committed to this and worked very, very hard with those civil society groups that penned the original Lancet piece and worked closely with him. So we're very grateful to him for that, even though he's dealing with not only a pandemic, but with the fact that 70% of the global health workforce is women, but only 20% of the global health workforce is leadership. So we have a lot of work to do. The second impact group that convened at the same time was trade. And that consisted of the International Trade Center, still leaders, but then led by Arantxa Gonzalez, who was the executive director at the time. the ambassador of Sierra Leone, Yvette Stevens, and the ambassador of Iceland, who is Hogni Kristjansson, who's an amazing ally. He was shortly replaced by another wonderful ally, Harold Asperland, who stays with us to this day. Together, they wrote, they took their political capital, and they went forth into the world with a groundbreaking Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, which is now called the Buenos Aires Declaration at the WTO, and is the first time women have ever been mentioned in a WTO document or a GATT document, and now represents 75% of global trade. So all of which we're going to discuss in a moment, with the impressive accomplishments of the Justice Impact Group and the Hague Principles on Sexual Violence, the Disarmament Impact Group's work off-screen and also on the global stage, which led to their nomination as Arms Control Persons of the Year in 2018, and the Representation Impact Group's Transformative Gender Responsive Assemblies Toolkit. So now I want to turn to my colleague, Martin Chungong, Secretary General of the IPU, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, who's been a champion since the very first day when we launched in 2015, is a co-chair of the Representation Impact Group, and is now our fearless leader and our IGC Global Chair. So I don't know who better than you, Martin, to talk about what special value you see in the impact groups and what they provide IGC. You must unmute. You must unmute. Yeah, better. Try now. No? Technology. Say some. No, you're still muted. So whoever. He's going to have to go tell someone to turn on the audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderfully.
Okay, thank you.
I hope you heard the nice things we were saying about you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I did. Thank you very much. And yesterday I was pleased to launch this week-long celebrations of our achievements and milestones. And there have been many. And today we are looking at one aspect of our work as the International Gender Champions, which I consider to be very important. And if we look at our network, we'll see that there are three main pillars. You have the gender parity pledge, you have the individual commitments by champions, and then you have the impact groups. This is what makes our network very unique, in that we have a great diversity of expertise in a wide range of areas. The people who are international gender champions are working in a wide variety of fields, and it would have been a pity if we did not tap into this valuable resource in order to enrich what we are trying to do to promote more progressive policies at the international level. So we have international organizations, permanent missions, we have civil society and private entities all as part of the IGC. And although we do have our day-to-day business to deal with, we do see that these organizations and entities are teeming with lots of knowledge and ideas. And the fact that we're able to engage with both the leaders of these organizations and the experts on gender issues helps us to convene the pillars, the two pillars of transformation, which is political will and technical knowledge. And I think that's the value that the impact group brings to us. These impact groups allow us then to go just higher collectively and strategically. And we bring our individual knowledge and ideas together. And together we can bargain for fairer and more gender responsive norms. So I think that what we should be doing over the next 5 years, as we have covered a lot of ground, is to make sure that we have more impact groups covering a wider variety of areas in which our various champions are working. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. So that's a very fabulous segue for us to go to the trade impact group. But as I said before, the reason why the impact groups we have made the tremendous impact, need I say it again, that they have, is that they have been led by leaders at the top of their organization that have gone to Capitol when they need to, who have really reached out and asked people to sort of put a little bit more, leave a little bit more on the floor. So for that reason, I'm going to turn immediately to Ambassador Molokomme of Botswana, who's one of the co-chairs of the Trade Impact Group, to ask what problem is the Trade Impact Group still actively trying to solve after the declaration.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, and warm greetings to all colleagues. Delighted to be part of these celebrations. I congratulate all of us, especially Martin, our chair of the Global Board. Look, I think we all know that despite the achievement of gender equality in some respects, in some areas over recent decades, the empowerment of women in the field of trade has lagged behind. I mean, this is still the case now, because of a lack of appreciation, or rather, inadequate appreciation of the interlinkages between trade, gender, and development. So gender equality, as espoused under the Beijing Program of Action and the Sustainable Development Goals, is far from being achieved in this field. I always say trade seems to be the last frontier, because we have made progress in many other areas. Here in International Geneva, as champions, I believe that we learned early on within the context of the WTO that development issues such as trade and gender have largely been left out of discussions on development. And attempts to raise gender issues, gender equality issues, have often, been stuck in the wider and systemic dynamics of the WTO negotiations, because there is such an emphasis on rules and on, people trying to avoid looking like they're negotiating new instruments, when in fact, what we are trying to do is to mainstream gender into what the WTO does. So as you explained, Caitlin, during the build-up to the 11th ministerial conference that was held in Argentina, the Trade Impact Group motivated discussions around trade. As we all know, the rest is a very good history, that a number of Geneva-based ambassadors and international organizations, including the ITC, and I'd like to acknowledge very much the ITC here, used this opportunity to develop the declaration, as you've already said. So the conference provided an opportunity to build awareness on how trade and gender are key to ensuring inclusive development. So the momentum that the declaration has gained, and supported at the time by 118 countries in Buenos Aires, has now increased to 127, which translates to about 77% of the 164 WTO members. So the declaration has put gender issues on the agenda of the multilateral trading system, but there's still a lot to be done to gather more political commitment, as Martin says in his remarks. And we need to expand, of course, the endorsement of the declaration by more countries. Continued advocacy and mainstreaming of the declaration remains a challenge. So we still have a very important reason to exist, change mindsets of policymakers to become more ambitious, and not just commit to gender-responsive trade policies, but also to actually implement on the ground, operationalize the commitments that we have in the declaration. So that really is the crux of the issue, or the what you could call a problem, but I'd rather call it a challenge, because I think we are on it. We are making good progress. And of course, when you look at the trade policy review process at the WTO, you will see that about 70% of countries integrated women's empowerment in their national or regional trade strategies. What remains to be seen, obviously, of course, is once again moving from those commitments made in the TPR to action. So I believe that now we must be talking and focusing on how and what needs to be done. So the ITC, our Trade Impact Group has put together a publication that contains information exchange and seminars, including policy recommendations and best practices shared to operationalize the economic empowerment of women by policymakers. And I'm looking forward to hearing Dorothy share a little bit about this publication, so that the whole picture emerges of what remains really to be done and where we'll be taking our work from here. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Ambassador. All right, well, now it's time to hear from the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, Dorothy. Tembo, as you just said, we're really interested, what are the key lessons that have come about as a result of this trade impact group's work?
Okay. I'm on. Thank you very much, Kathleen, and may I also join others in expressing how happy I am to be able to join this conversation, but more importantly, to be able to celebrate the milestone that has been achieved, which is the 5 years. Very pleasing indeed that we continue to make efforts on the gender front to try and make sure that we keep putting the building steps together to get to the bigger achievements. And as Ambassador Molokomme just said, I think I do agree with her. Perhaps trade is the last frontier, but even within that, it's very clear to us, and I believe to all those that may also be participating in this conversation, that a lot still remains to be done, not only in the trade arena, but in many, many other areas. I think acknowledging that we have done some good, but there's still plenty that needs to be done to better position ourselves. And many lessons that we have learned as the first step that we have taken in the last few years, but perhaps sharing with you 3 or 4 key ones that I have seen. Clear recognition, we are not yet there, but it's also very clear to us that people do care. People really do care about gender issues. And that in itself is reflected by how far we've come since the time that we started the conversations to having the Buenos Aires Declaration actually going through and being signed to by 127 countries. It's a reflection of that care. And this care being done, coming through at very, very high levels of commitment. I have never seen a process that has brought together the technical people and the highest level of the political level within the context of the World Trade Organization actually discussing issues relating to gender. From the days that I was back home and participating in the negotiation, this was a no-go. And for us to come with that milestone, it's really something that we should be proud of. So the issue for me is I have seen that leading up to Buenos Aires, but post Buenos Aires as well, because there's that high level assumption of ownership. It has actually activated not only greater attention, but also the desire to actually be more concrete in terms of the results that we want to achieve going beyond Buenos Aires. And this is a very clear signal for me. The most important ingredient is to have that ownership, and that the members of the WTO are now trying to lead this process in a way that moves us to achieving greater achievements. Second point is that from this process, it has become very clear that there were a lot of misconceptions about gender aspects. In a number of cases, people not really even understanding why we needed to work on the trade side. What value was it going to bring to the table? But in the work that the Trade Impact Group has done, it has helped to demystify a lot of what was seen to be perhaps misunderstood. Through the activities that we have undertaken, and Ambassador did make reference to the specific seminars which had different themes, where, granulating some of the issues, making it easier for others to better understand what value was in there, the publications in themselves, sharing the different experiences, but also bringing some of these elements right into the WTO processes, such as the trade policy review, is a major step that should always be acknowledged. That in itself has sensitized countries, not only that they need to pay attention to this aspect, but it's also an aspect of using this channel for others to learn from. And here I couldn't agree more with the opening introductory remarks that were made, that each of us bringing our expertise to the table has really helped in trying to better leverage that expertise in a way that is useful to the countries. Third point is that it's very clear we need to keep that pedal on the gas. Otherwise, we will lose the momentum that we have gained. And in part, these are some of the challenges that are perhaps coming with COVID-19, but maybe I leave that for later. And finally, the takeaway we have is that this work would not be possible or would not be able to achieve the type of impact we are looking for unless we really forge forward with ensuring that the partnership, the strategic partnerships that we are getting into are ones that we certainly build on. Clearly, from the work that we have done with other partners in the context of this work, if I'm to take an example like UPS, we have seen what it is that can be achieved. But we need to broaden this and make sure that we are consolidating those efforts.
Well, thank you. But I want to follow up on that question is what effect do you think the pandemic, COVID-19, is going to have on the work of the group?
COVID-19, I think, has taken all of us by I don't know if surprise would be the right word to use. I think when we were ending the year, last year, we had the meetings, or probably at the beginning of this year, and we had a very good plan as to how we wanted to take things forward. And suddenly we are confronted with COVID-19, which has completely changed the way we live, the way we consume, the way we do business. And perhaps this could be a change that remains with us for our entire life going forward. We really are at a point where we don't really know how this is going to evolve. But within all this, what I know is that women enterprises have actually been more impacted than the male enterprises. Why do I say that? We have conducted a survey of businesses, which has covered 4,000 plus entities. And clearly from there, the women have been more affected. The sectors that they're very active in are the ones that have been very, very affected. For instance, in tourism, in consumer-related sectors, these are ones where women have been very active. It's also come out through the responses that we have received that 1 in 3 of the enterprises are actually faced with a situation where they could go bankrupt or they could shut down permanently. These are the facts that we have on the ground. Huge shift. You have orders canceled. You have had business practices evolving with social distancing. You probably cannot do your business anymore. But beyond that, it has also been an issue of the other implications of COVID. In most family households, the women have had to turn to start looking after the children who have been out of school. It has also been very clear that where there are people that have been affected by the virus, that the women are becoming the carers. So in all this, they still have to find ways and means of doing business to earn that income. So it is very clear to us that whilst we have this situation, the women enterprises needs have even become more in the current situation. We already were coming from a perspective where issues, as Ambassador then had said earlier on, Ambassador Molokomme, that a lot still needs to be done. We are talking about access to finance, we are talking about many other things. But what COVID has done is actually to compound an already challenging situation for women in business. And this is really what we have to deal with. What we have established is that they have been very much in need of ensuring that we are there to give that hand-holding to enable them to adjust to the new modalities of doing business. What has become very clear to us is that those that have been using the e-channel for trading are the ones that have been able to be sustained. So that demand to make that adjustment has been one that has come in even more at this time. What I wanted to also add to that is in instances where they have been resources provided by the different government, the women have not had access, many of the women have not had access to the information, neither have they been able to have the access to the financing because of the already existing challenges that they were facing. But now in this situation, perhaps even no prioritization is being given to women in a number of cases. What does this mean? Effectively, we risk undermining all the positive steps that we have taken up to this point. So we have to make sure that we are keeping that pedal going down, making the noises that we have been making, but more importantly, ensuring that we are moving forward with the action that builds on Buenos Aires, because the point being there that we need to, of course, Geneva context remains very, very important, but at the end of the day is what the members do with what we provide within the Geneva context operationally. So we've got to ensure that we are transitioning some of this work to happen on the ground for us to be able to create that transformation that we so much envisaged in the conceptualization of this initiative.
Wow, thank you very much. Well, to follow on that, I'm going to ask your colleague, Ambassador Molokomme, about what's next for the Trade Impact Group. So specifically, given this very particular situation we're now in, what comes next?
Well, thanks very much, and thanks Dorothy for taking us from that high level of international or global, regional, and cascading to the national level. The importance of implementation, concrete, meaningful action on the ground. That is very important. Of course, we all operate at different levels, and so here in Geneva, the way we are looking at it is that we need to have a phase 2. We need post-Buenos Aires. We have achieved, we have a declaration, we have a lot of signatures, we have these seminars, we have publications, but we need to move ahead and raise the bar even higher. So for example, we are looking at a future agenda on trade and women's and economic empowerment at the multilateral level. COVID, of course, has really stopped us, many of us, and a lot of our work in its tracks. We have been able to talk around the period of lockdown, to reflect and read. So in a way, these are also opportunities. But the way we want to move is that whatever we will do will be guided by a number of principles here at the global level, connecting obviously also to the regional and the domestic level. First of all, we want the process to be member-driven. It's very important in organizations like the WTO, whatever you do moving forward, that the process be member-driven to ensure ownership and implementation on the ground. So we want to work with all the 127 members that support the Buenos Aires Declaration. Secondly, we would like the work to be brought into the WTO. Remember, this is about mainstreaming. It's not about parallel activities and so on. Within the framework of what we see as an informal, open, and transparent working group in the WTO. So to some extent, you need to get into the processes and institutions of the WTO without necessarily creating new obligations or commitments. Our experts are working on the specifics and modalities of how this is going to happen. So it's essential, we believe, to build on the Buenos Aires Declaration and increase the level of ambition, as I said, push the bar higher and achieve change. So a declaration is being prepared, building on the key objectives and momentum of Buenos Aires in 2017 and framing an ambitious and structured agenda. We have a draft, which I can't share right now, but we want to make sure that the process importantly is inclusive and that the future agenda on trade and women's economic empowerment espouses a modular approach that is adaptable to different priorities, capabilities, and levels of ambition of the broad coalition of supporting WTO members. Once again, very important to take everybody with us, certainly our 127 members. We want to encourage new signatories, all the while not holding the more ambitious converted members or marginalizing members with fewer resources and capabilities. So we want to make sure that there is inclusion. So, and we want to move the trade, the women's empowerment and gender equality agenda beyond the WTO, because the WTO is not the only place where trade policy is made. It is an important place. So we need to mainstream trade and gender issues into policy. trade policy at all levels, and making sure that there are those interconnections Dorothy spoke about between the global and the domestic.
All right.
That's where we are trying to go.
That's a lot of places to go, but that's pretty amazing and very exciting. And look forward to working together with you, all of us, with you as your colleagues, because it's brilliant, brilliant work. What you sort of said about involving everyone, sort of nothing about us without us, which is the feminist phrase, leads us very well into a segue into introductions for the Justice Impact Group, which is led from The Hague. It's co-chaired by Canada, originally formed by Ambassador Sabine Nolke, now led by Ambassador Lisa Helfand of Canada, and with the very able co-chair of Sweden, Ambassador Annika Markovic, who's with us today. So hello, Ambassador.
Hello and welcome to the City of Peace and Justice, The Hague.
Yeah, well, okay, well, Geneva also thinks it's a city of peace, so you don't want to start a fight about like
No. Peace and justice, peace and justice.
All the villages of the world. But you're the newest group in the IGC Impact family. How did you choose this topic of justice surrounding sexual violence in conflict? And why is this so necessary to address?
So since we are in the City of Peace and Justice, it was only natural that we wanted to focus this impact group on justice and gender equality and in the administration of international justice, including accountability for sexual and gender-based crimes, but also on initiatives that advance the representation of women in the different international organizations that we have here in The Hague. So we took the decision to focus on sexual and gender-based crimes since rape, sexual slavery, and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence have been taken to horrific levels in armed conflicts, and because impunity still prevails. Those responsible for these crimes must be held accountable, and the victims deserve justice. And as you might know, the Rome Statute was the first international criminal law instrument to include crimes of sexual violence. And although the prosecutor's strategy has secured important convictions, notably in the Natanga case with the court's actually first ever conviction for crimes related to sexual slavery, accountability is still very limited. So one of the barriers which contributes to impunity is a lack of understanding and a clear definition of what makes sexual violence sexual. Simply put, the definition of the elements of crimes is circular. Sexual violence is essentially defined as an act of violence that is of sexual nature. So this can create a disparity between how sexual violence is perceived and experienced by victims and how it is adjudicated, as well as inconsistent jurisprudence. And that is why we consider that the issue of justice surrounding sexual violence is so important to address. However, it all started with the CSO campaign led by Women's Initiative for Gender Justice, a campaign that is called Call It What It Is, which Sweden has supported politically as well as financially. And this CSO initiative seeks to create a working definition of sexual violence in the context of international criminal justice. And it has created the Hague Principles on Sexual Violence that you mentioned before. And these principles consist of a CSO declaration, which provide general guidance on what makes violence sexual, a tool for practitioners, and key principles for policymakers. So we have supported through the Gender Justice Impact Group this initiative by the CSO, and we have made some successful moves in that context to make sure that everyone is aware of the challenges of the definition in the judicial system.
One of the things that I think is so amazing about that particular part of this process is that your colleagues asked women themselves in countries and regions of conflict what sexual violence meant to them. So this is really sourced, when we talk about this nothing about us without us, really sourced from the women and men.
Yeah, exactly. It's not only the women.
Exactly. It's gender-based violence who have experienced this as a form of oppression, tool of war. And really, this definition comes from them. You're then able to, which I thought was quite brilliant, been able to take that into the political arena and to start talking to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to see what, as you said, the Rome Statute, what definitions you need really to get the kind of justice that's deserved for people who are survivors of violence such as this. So specifically, I know that you have a whole game plan for this year. What are you doing to sort of help bring this forward in your sphere of influence there in The Hague?
So firstly, we will continue to raise awareness about sexual violence in order to contribute to strengthening both national and international capacities to prosecute perpetrators and to enhance victim and witness protection. And secondly, we will continue to work in close collaboration with different actors, including, of course, the civil society organizations, states, international organs, courts, and tribunals. And we should remember that the ICC is complementary to national jurisdiction. So it is the right and responsibility of states to prosecute international crimes. The ICC may only exercise jurisdiction where national legal systems fail to do so, where they are unable or unwilling. And the Swedish and Canadian delegations actively pursued this issue during the last meeting of the ICC Assembly of States Parties. We actually suggested new paragraphs in the so-called omnibus resolution, and the aim was there to draw attention to the work already done by the court, as well as to the importance of increasing the knowledge of these crimes, the understanding of these crimes, and cooperation between stakeholders. For example, we are convinced that the ICC collection of evidence could be improved if we give a voice to the victims of sexual violence, and that sharing of best practices as well as adequate training of both ICC staff and elected officials could contribute to better understanding of sexual violence among the judiciary and among the investigators. So the Assembly of States Parties decided to encourage the Bureau to engage with interested states parties and other relevant actors to find ways to support the efforts of the court in this regard. And in addition to our activities related to sexual violence, my own commitments as an international gender champion also include to encourage the international organizations and courts in The Hague to attain gender balance and to integrate the gender perspective in their normative and operational work. And here, I think it's really important to continue the discussion on how do you integrate this gender perspective in our day-to-day work. Because very often, when you talk about integrating a gender perspective, the reaction is that, yes, we look at the numbers, we look at the statistics, and we see how many male and how many female people we have in the leadership of the organization or in the whole of the organization. But of course, you know, because you are also gender champions, that a gender perspective is not just about the numbers and the statistics. It's very much about putting on the gender lens and understanding what a decision, you know, what difference a decision could make depending on the gender, for example, or how you integrate a gender perspective in your budget, or how you integrate it in your strategic plan. And it's these issues that we really try to raise all the time when we are discussing the budget of the different international organizations to make sure that we continue this deliberation. So we have many things to do. And I really want to say happy birthday to all of us. I think it's wonderful that we have these impact groups. And it's really great that we have this kind of discussion today, because then we can inspire each other and we can also learn from each other. And I think that's going to make the impact even greater in the future. So thank you very much for organizing it.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you for this work on the Hague principles, because I think it's really also going to be very transformative and long-term, as is all of the work that all of our colleagues are doing. So now for the Disarmament Impact Group, who I think may feel you trade co-chairs that they are the last frontier in gender, but we shall see what they say. We have the original co-chairs, some of them with us, UNIDIR Director Renata Dwan, and Ambassador Michael Gaffey of Ireland, who are with us today. Canada remains as a co-chair. We shout out to Ambassador Rosemary McCartney, who's instrumental in putting the group together, along with Namibia, who remains a co-chair. Originally co-chaired by Ambassador Sabine Bolke-Muller, now back in Capital, and led ably now by the current Namibian Ambassador Penda Nanda, is not here with us today. We are, however, joined with the third co-chair on this particular webinar, an important member of the Disarmament Impact Group, Deputy Permanent Representative Maria Teresa Torres Almojuela of the Philippines. So I now will turn the floor over to our Disarmament Impact Group colleagues and ask Ambassador Gaffey to just tell us a bit about why and how the Impact Group was formed.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, and hello everyone. And it's really good to be celebrating this 5th anniversary. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, you said it, Caitlin, first. I was going to say, having listened to our trade Impact Group colleagues, that we perhaps could now start by having an argument on which is the last frontier in these thematic areas, because I think we might definitely argue that disarmament and arms control is the last frontier. But it's great that we are all on the last frontier and pushing ahead. I mean, disarmament and arms control, I mean, it's hard to think of a more important area in terms of even existentialism. You know, if it goes wrong, everything else can go wrong. And yet the discussions on disarmament have tended to be seen by other diplomats, the non-disarmament diplomats, as a sort of an abstruse, technical, difficult area that you should try and stay away from if you value your mental health. And that's really quite unfortunate, especially if you look at the successes in the past of multilateral action in the area of disarmament. But what we really felt there was an opportunity. Number one, the Sustainable Development Goals gave us a real opportunity to look at disarmament in a new, broader context. Likewise, the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And I think a lot of us felt that in the area of disarmament, we were just a little bit behind, although there was a lot of work on the gendered impacts of armed violence and the vital importance of including women in disarmament negotiations and peace-building programs. There was a lot of talk developing on representation, on numbers, but also we felt it important to broaden that discussion beyond just the numbers to the impact, to what it actually means in terms of more effective and sustainable policy outcomes, to have a more representative group of people discussing these truly vital issues. And before we were even established, this view was being backed up by research from UNIDIR and civil society, demonstrating not only that women remained unrepresented, but that this was having an impact on policy. And the truth is that women still comprise only about 30% of diplomats in arms control and disarmament forums. And that has to have an impact. So we set ourselves up, or were established, and thank you for introducing us and saying just who was involved in this really cross-regional group in 2018. And I think having taken it on, it seemed initially a bit of a daunting task. I think we were pushing an open door. We held an initial lunch in September 2018. And we're really impressed by the interest across the system, not just among classical disarmament diplomats, but also more broadly, that there was a real interest in making progress across the board here on disarmament. And it was great then after that initial launch to be able to welcome Philippines on board. And I think what we've been trying to do throughout is not just to talk about the obvious need to include more women and have much more representative group of people discussing this existential issue, but also to look across all the different conventions, all the different meetings in the area of nuclear disarmament and of arms control. And in each case, to identify positive outcomes that we could work for, to identify them in advance and provide briefing papers and work with delegations in that regard. Now, it strikes me that it's a bit like something we learned about in the Irish peace process. There are some things which eventually will be taken as stating the obvious, but it takes you a long time to get to that point. So we find we have to state the obvious, or what seems to us to be the obvious, quite regularly. And we are making progress, but I think that we will continue having to state the obvious, both on representation and moving ahead on more substantive work on outcomes for a while to come, because it does feel a bit like the last frontier, but it does feel like we're pushing an open door and that we are starting to make a difference.
Have you addressed what some of your achievements have been and how you've gone about your work?
Well, I think what our biggest, apart from awareness raising, which is really important, I think our biggest achievements has been in looking across the different, the specific meetings and conventions and identifying areas of progress that could be made in those meetings. For instance, last year, we led on a joint statement on gender at the Arms Trade Treaty, the 5th Conference of State Parties. And that's got the support of 46 states parties and stressed the importance of gender perspectives in armed control. It was followed by a second joint statement that we led on in the first committee in New York, which attracted the support of 80 states. So we are getting support, we are building awareness, but as I said, it's a constant battle. But what we want to do is to build awareness and do so by identifying practical actions that can be taken at the different meetings.
Wow, fabulous. So I'm going to turn to one of your colleagues, Director Renata Dwan, to ask you what some of the specific challenges for gender mainstreaming in disarmament diplomacy are and how to tackle them.
Hi everyone, and great to be here, and happy birthday to us all. It's also great to hear the exchanges about the different impact groups and what's worked and what's not, because we've drawn from the representation group, and I'll talk about that in a moment. You know, I suppose we all want a special plead, as Michael said, about our own cases and why it's just quite so important and quite so difficult. But I would say a couple of things that are distinct about disarmament. The first is, and perhaps the trade has some common points on this, areas that are seen as highly technical and requiring a long tradition and history tend to be very difficult to enter into for younger women and for women who are coming into diplomacy later, as we know in the broader diplomacy all around the world in many areas. Second, in our area of arms control, there's a perception of the military and a military background being helpful, and that's another area that has for many years been closed to or limited to women in what they can do. A third, and I was struck by this with the trade interests as well, and it'd be interesting to see will it be a factor for justice. There's a perception often of hard negotiation, aggression being a key part of a good arms control negotiator. And so perception that perhaps women are representing, you know, in some of the biases and the stereotypes that go with it, not what you see as the person you bring to your bilateral arms negotiation table or your plurilateral or multilateral one. So I think breaking down some of those perceptions are super important. The other aspect I would say, and this has been repeated in all the focus groups, we've run a series of focus groups for our researchers and trying to ask people why they see the gaps and why, as Michael pointed out, disarmament is the lowest represented area of women in all the UN multilateral processes. And it's often a perception of lack of role models. Younger women coming into the career, not seeing other women in senior leaderships. And we have 20% women represented in senior leadership positions in arms control. If we keep going at the current rate, it will be 5 decades before we have gender parity on arms control issues at leadership level. So that's, I think, for us, a big driver, and it's something distinct about arms control. And I think it's not something that is just the old worlds of perhaps the old nuclear issues, but we even see it in the new issues, in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, what's called the STEM areas, around artificial intelligence, around cyber areas where you would think, well, this is a newer area and it's not going to have the baggage of the last. We are seeing even less women represented in some of the ongoing discussions in Geneva right now around lethal autonomous weapon systems. So I think it just demonstrates to us that we've got a way to go. A couple of points I would also then just flag that what we learned. I think evidence-based research is really critical. And I would just underscore that when we want to have impact as groups, having data, being able to point to statistics, and the work that the UN is doing now on tracking women participating and speaking in multilateral bodies, I think is a good awareness-raising step that can help us on this. 2, bringing different communities together. Often what we have found is, as Michael said, is we were pushing on an open door, but the idea of making gender more than a paragraph in arms control, people would say, but how? Tell me what I needed to do. So sometimes it was really bringing women in the peace and security agenda and community together with the arms control community or the armed conflict community and saying, have you guys met? And maybe you need, including at national levels. And I think that's an important area of trying to connect these two communities. In terms of tools, I think Michael pointed out a few, but I would just flag there, we produced easy how-to guides for all chairs of arms control processes. And that's where we drew on the representation impact group and their super vital resource handbook for chairs and said, this is what you might think about when you're chairing an arms control, a multi-state process. So that was, I think, really helpful. And then on, as Michael said, concrete picking 3 to 4 forums that we would focus on each year. And really saying, here are some concrete practical ideas that you can bring into your discussions on the Arms Trade Treaty. So not enforcing our views, making that, as the trade group implied, it really needs to be owned by different member states, but in terms of doing your homework for you and saying, here's a handy 2-page and here's a handy event that you can come to in the context of you're attending this intergovernmental discussion and get the cheat sheet, so to speak. I would say that some of it has been introducing new things. For example, the first side events on gender issues ever in discussions on Biological Weapons Convention and in the context of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which we worked with our colleagues in The Hague on. And so I think there's also just that issue of this back to bringing communities that haven't often engaged in, has been something that we've had to tackle, particularly in the disarmament sphere.
Wow, it's incredible, incredible work and really valuable things that I think can be applied across sectors. Your colleague, Deputy Permanent Representative Almojuela, who's, forgive me for it's the DPR part, slip me up. I wanted to know, there's such a large arena of disarmament work. So which areas do you feel that you as a group need to focus on for impact in this coming year?
Well, thank you and good afternoon, Excellencies and Kathleen. Happy to be part of this celebration and to stand on the shoulders of our predecessors who worked on this very important initiative, evolving but generating a lot of impact where they matter. I would, of course, anchor my initial answer on the statements made by Ambassador Gaffey and Renata about proceeding from an evidence-based anchor, because we do have, if you look at the survey made by the UNIDIR on representation of women in the disarmament bodies, it shows that there's still very much to be done on the representation, especially in very technical areas of work. And this includes the GGE processes on ammunition space, where that is heavily dominated by men. So we proceed from this, but as mentioned by Renata, generally there's much work to be done on balancing women representation in the first committee and the disarmament processes compared to other processes in New York, where, for example, you only have 30% representation of women in the first committee and 50% in the other committees. We have to push harder on this. But as I always say, the big picture is these representations naturally follow representations of women in capitals, in the defense, security, and arms control sector. And therefore, we need to get things done to support national policies to mainstream women in the work. Even for a country like the Philippines, we only opened our National Military Academy to women in 1992, and we only have the first women general recently. It's important to continue to support national frameworks, but also regional processes, because we see that in the end, they create a big difference in the way the regions develop more gendered perspectives on their work. One example of the work we've taken with Norway in ASEAN is the Women in Peace and Security Registry, because there's an assumption that there's very few women involved in peace and security, but the existence of this registry in the region, the ASEAN, confirms that it's not the case. We have women involved, and if you look at these resources, we can have women participating and taking part in our processes. We should also be working on getting beyond seeing balance in women representation in the negotiation table, because we've, as mentioned by Renata, it's about having more girls and women taking part as scientists, as technical experts, in the way that they support all the work, the ecosystem that supports the work of the architecture for arms control and disarmament. Now, going to my particular work in Geneva, where I have the privilege of assuming the presidency of the CCW, Conventional Weapons AP2. Again, this is an example of where I am standing on the shoulders of those who have come before me, because last year, the high contracting parties have succeeded in including in the outcome document a direction for the CCW to seek and pursue more balanced representation of women in the CCW process. And I will be following that when I conduct my work and lead the experts meeting in September and the conference in November. We hope to consider, of course, more strongly than before, gender consideration on the program of work of the experts, including on clearance of improvised explosive devices, risk education, and so many other aspects of the work under the CCW, this protocol in particular. We are also the Philippines is also part of the coordinating bureau, the coordinating committee, supporting the work of the president of the Cluster Munitions Convention, Ambassador Baumann of Switzerland. And here we are hoping to contribute to pursue language in the Lausanne plan of action that will guide the work of the five-year program of the CCM going forward. And we are strongly supporting the inclusion of gender language in the cross-cutting elements of the convention. And these are very practical, concrete work on the ground. What do we mean with impact? We feel that we should evolve the meaning of impact and disarmament, not only in having better representation of women at the table, but getting more of our women involved in the substantive, the technical, the granular work of our arms control and disarmament architecture, and in strengthening them. And with this, we also find that we have we get a lot of support from the UNSG, who the UN Secretary General has paid significant attention to the relation between gender disarmament and gender and disarmament, as well as the link between disarmament and development. And I think this is the bigger context under all of us are doing our work in this group of champions. Thank you, Caitlin.
Well, thank you very much. There's just so much work to be done, but it's also so amazing how much work is being done and how many inroads that you all have made. It's really quite extraordinary to me. What a perfect segue to talk about the Representation Impact Group next, one of the oldest groups. which has always been co-chaired by Sweden. And in this regard, we say a fond hello to Ambassador Veronica Bard, who's been a stalwart friend and leader with us, and has served also as leadership of the IGC steering group when the US stepped down and before Canada stepped up as part of kind of management, member state management of the tripartite group. I'm joined, as I said before, by my co-chair in the Representation Impact Group, the wonderful Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, who we call the IPU, has taught us really so much and led the way for so long. So I turn to you first, dear SG. By the way, I don't know if everybody's noticed, I have been calling all the women by their titles. And, but here I'm going to sort of revert to calling some people by first name. I hope you don't see it as being disrespectful. Normally it's men that get called by titles, not women. So dear colleague, dear Martin, why this group? Why is representation so important?
Thank you very much. Once again, Kathleen, I think that if we say that democracy is the route we want to go down in the way society functions and government functions, if we want to achieve good governance, then we cannot make any abstraction of representation. Representation goes to the very core of democracy and good governance. I think that if we are talking about more legitimate, more effective and efficient institutions and decisions, we cannot just disregard representation. And let's also not forget that international conventions and treaties actually enshrine equal representation as a human right. So from that point of view, we have a foundation on which to build, which we have been using so far. It happens that I run an organization that has put gender equality in decision-making at the core of its mission. And for us, we think that this is not only a prerequisite for genuine democracy, it's also a precondition for peace and sustainable development. And there's a lot of evidence out there to substantiate this point. Not that we want to say that when women are women have to justify why they have to be at the table. I think it's wrong to do that, but we do have evidence out there that shows that representation, when it is equitable and equal, we have better outcomes. And let me just use one example. Last night I was on this conversation with Foreign Policy magazine, and the point was made that when we look at the response to the COVID crisis today, the most effective and successful responses have been led by women leaders, which is, I think, a good thing to say for leadership of women. So gender, for us, representation, equality in representation is something that we need to look at various levels. And we, at the international level, we should be able to walk the talk. If we want people to, we want institutions and decision-making processes to be, I would say, legitimate, we at the international level should be looking at this. And previous speakers have made the point that we have to go beyond numbers. And that is what the impact group has been trying to do. We don't just look at the quantity of representation, we are also looking at the quality, the outcomes of representation when women are at the table. Sorry to borrow the name of your association, Caitlin. I think it typifies what it is that we're talking about. So we need to make sure that we are talking about horizontal representation, not just vertical, so that women are part of all deliberations in the institutions where they are present, that gender issues are at the fore, and that these are defended not only by women, but also by men. We must make the point that gender equality and representation is not something that is left in the hands of women alone. It is for us to work together, especially so as processes continue to be male-dominated. By the way, I point out that this panel today is women-dominated. I think we can excuse ourselves today because it's our birthday. See that out of the 7 members of the panel, 5 are women, so there's no gender parity here, but I think that we can forgive ourselves. So for us, we do think that it is important that women are involved in different governance processes, that they are allowed to contribute when they are in those positions to, they're allowed to contribute in a way that brings to the fore the added value that they bring to the discussions, and that this can enrich the deliberations and the outcome. So I do think that what we require and what the impact group should continue to promote is one, institutional commitment, making sure that gender equality is a major part of our discussion and discourse. And also we need individual leadership. And I think we do have that in the International Gender Champions. And together we can work to embed policies within our organizations, within our diplomatic missions that ensure accountability, that bring about change in culture and mindset, and that would then lead to more legitimate, more effective, and more efficient processes and institutions. So I think that this is the core business of the impact group that I am honored to chair with you, Kathleen, and Veronica Bad. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's also a perfect segue to everything that you've said, from which I learned so much, this whole notion of quantitative, qualitative representation too, which you have really just teased out so well in many different settings, has really been something that I carried in my heart. So altogether, what did we decide to do? We decided to, I don't know, can I see myself here? We decided to write a gender responsive assemblies toolkit and take all the vast learnings from all of our colleagues and put them down in a sort of a handy guide. So we asked our colleagues at the International Labor Organization, ILO, IOM, the ISO, International Standards Organization, Telecommunication Union, ITU, Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, OHCHR, High Commissioner for Human Rights, of course, the UN Office at Geneva, the World Health Organization, WIPO, World Meteorological Organization, UNCTAD, and the Framework on Climate Change. Whew, all of them contributed with best and living practices to gender responsive assemblies, which is really quite amazing. So we put together a compendium of things in a very short, snappy little toolkit that actually are already being used by each of these organizations, by the heads of those organizations. So there's no need to go to legal to ask, is it all right for us to have a gender equality body? No, you must ask perhaps your governing body, but you don't need to see whether you have a right to do so. So this toolkit deals with before, during, and after assemblies. And it starts with the things that are really so fundamental, like sending a letter out to all your delegations when they're going to register to remind them that they should bring gender balanced delegations, including having women as chairs of those delegations, because it's also where's the authority, right? To things that are happening at the middle of the assembly, such as the chair or the SG, making a strong, strong statement about gender equality and the way that they want the proceedings to work, as we've seen that ILO do, we've seen the Human Rights Council do, we've seen WHO do coming from this. We also know what's happening during the assembly where processes like WMO, again, a highly technical organization, decided to just highlight the gender imbalance in all their delegations and put it up on the front of the screen in all of their plenaries when they had assemblies. So we've taken a lot of best practices, many, many of which come from IPU, who has really genuinely led the way in all of this. And we put it together in this book. So I go back to my colleague. How was the toolkit launched, and what else are we doing? And especially, how can we take advantage of remote meetings now that we're living in a COVID-19 universe?
That's me again.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think I had the pleasure of launching this toolkit in New York together with Ambassador Jörg Lober, the Swiss ambassador in New York, the Trinidadian ambassador, and the executive director of UN Women. And I think it was well received. It has been popularized a lot, and we're happy that we came up with this, because as I said in my previous intervention, we need to be seen as international organizations to be walking the talk. If we're going to be preaching to others about gender parity, gender equality, we should be seen to be practicing it ourselves. And this toolkit is one that actually shows how we can do things. It is possible to have gender responsive assemblies. And then you asked a question about virtual modes of communication today. For us, it's all well and good that we're meeting virtually, we're showing that we're resilient and flexible, but then we have to be careful that the virtual nature of our meetings and interactions does not lead to us considering, or people considering, that gender parity is something that is a luxury, is an afterthought, that it's a good thing to have, and then leave it at that. We have to be careful not to go into a mindset where we would be unraveling all the gains and good practices that we have experienced over the past several years. And we do know that gender equality is something, or progress in gender equality is very fragile. And I've always said that there is no room for complacency. With the slightest barrier or hitch, we're going to unravel decades of what good work and practice that we have. So we have to be careful when we do our virtual meetings, not to be too informal, not to be organizing meetings at the last moment and then say gender equality is an afterthought. It's something that should be on the agenda, by the way. It should be there all the time. And then I think that it is the time now that we have these disruptions of the pandemic, that we should look at the opportunity of rededicating ourselves to our gender parity pledge. We should be ever more committed to that pledge, and to make sure that we can implement this. But of course, we are going to continue to rethink the way we do business. I don't believe that with the end of COVID, we are going to continue to do business as usual. We should strive to do better. We should look at all the flexibilities brought about by the new technologies that we have in place. For instance, we now know that we will be traveling less. I think that is certain. And this will be an opportunity for us to engage people who normally would be left behind because they don't have that opportunity or the resources that would allow them to travel. And then I go back to the parliamentary area that I know very well. And we have seen lots of good examples by parliaments that are adjusting their working methods in order to cope with the pandemic. They're establishing committees, dedicated committees, and many of them are insisting that these committees be gender balanced. When parliaments have had to reduce the number of people who are allowed to sit in plenary meetings, they have insisted on having equal numbers of men and women sitting in the plenary so that they are part and parcel of the decision-making process in such a delicate circumstance. And I think that this is something that we can replicate in all of our organizations and diplomatic missions. In sum, what I'm saying is that this is the moment for us to be innovative, to think of new ways of ensuring representation. I mean, equitable representation that brings about effectiveness and legitimacy.
And also we say to our colleagues who are at member states that you can go to the governing bodies that you are part of and to say, these are really simple things to implement. Others have done so. And so we ask you to take a look and bring yourselves along with us. I'm going to ask myself about a question about measurement. So we've always been interested, of course, in, we had said, is it men, how many women, but can we go a little bit beyond that and start to measure the qualitative, as you'd said, so it's not only quantitative. So I had thrown this out at a seminar at FAFL, which is a technical university here in Switzerland, and said, is there any way for us to measure the influence of women, not only the numbers of women speaking? And so long story short, with a huge group that was FAFL, Credit Suisse came in, added their design teams. We brought in, of course, IPU, Sweden, UNOG, WMO, WIPO, UNAIDS, UN Women, IUCN, And we wound up doing a design seminar in 2018 for 2 full days about what would we need, what is it like to run an international assembly. And we came up with a tool that we piloted last year at WMO's quadrennial conference. And now we were going to fully launch at IUCN's quadrennial conference. But since we've had a few more moments, we've upped the AI. And now we have a tool that will look at not only who's talking, but what they're talking about and for how long. So it's the number of women, and men, what the subjects are, who's talking about cybersecurity, who's talking about gender. Are they the head of a delegation? Are they an intern? Are they civil society? Are they a member state? At what capacity? And to really look at the full sort of more of a 360 picture of who's talking about what, when, where, how, and to see whether we can measure that over time. So we're very excited about that, which will launch in, pieces of which will launch in the fall, but the big full tool will launch at IUCN's conference, which is the wonderful deal we made with them, which has been postponed now till January 2021. So I am, and which brings us around to AI. So we have a few more minutes, but I would want to know if any of you have, I'm throwing this out at you, so none of you have to answer if you don't want. I have my own questions, but I'm tiring of my own voice. Whether you have questions to other members of other impact groups that you're interested in hearing what they have to say. Renata, Dwan.
Thanks very much, Caitlin, and thanks to all these interesting comments. I would like to inquire how people are thinking about marking the Women, Peace and Security Agenda 20 years in October this year. It's been a driver for those of us who work in peace and security, but of course it asserts rights to gender equality across all issues. So it's part of justice, and as our trade colleagues pointed out, part of trade. So it's a potentially big deal for us all in Geneva. And while we obviously face the challenges of COVID, I think it would be really interesting for us to reflect on how can we, either in our individual work streams or collectively, mark that event, and mark it at a time where some of the ways we might expect to see these events taking place, a Security Council meeting, open meeting, or those sorts of things, may not be open to us in the same way. So I'd be interested in colleagues' thoughts about that, and perhaps Caitlin, you Women at the Table and IGC already has a very big agenda in that, but I think it would be worth us to think about how we can maximize this moment at a time where, let's be honest, there's also quite a bit of pushback on the Women, Peace and Security agenda in some multilateral contexts.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. I can look to our trade colleagues first, if it's not putting you, either of you brilliant colleagues, on the spot, what you're thinking about that. And of course, Namibia as well, so, Ambassador Molokomme, Dorothy, Tembo, are you thinking of particular linkages between trade and the Women, Peace and Security agenda?
Well, look, thank you for raising that issue, Renata, because I do think that anniversaries are important, and we should always take advantage here in International Geneva of, dates that mean something, to look back and evaluate progress within themes like Women, Peace and Security, and perhaps across themes. And Michael, I'm happy to say maybe we are kind of all on the front row of the last frontier, the trade and the disarmament issues. And I do understand, having worked in justice and security myself, that that is really a difficult area. As you said, Maria Teresa in the Philippines, with the very slow progress towards women achieving high military positions. So I would be very open to perhaps carrying on this conversation about marking this 20th anniversary in October. And I think issues of women, peace and security are critical. They are fairly cross-cutting as well. So I think we could link with other themes and TIGs quite easily.
Would you like to take that up, Mr. Ambassador Gaffey?
Yes, thank you. And not that I'm going to answer Renata's question, but it's just striking me listening to this discussion that I think the COVID experience has, one of its effect has been to make us understand better the linkages between different thematic areas. We always talk about silos and breaking down silos, but the one thing that has been really clear about this COVID crisis is that in one ways, in practical terms, it has forced us to isolate ourselves, but in other ways, it has really, really demonstrated the linkages between thematic areas. And what really struck me is, in looking at disarmament and arms control, that has traditionally in recent years been seen by many practitioners as a completely separate area from women, peace and security. And part of the problem is, of course, that the women, peace and security agenda somehow originated or manifested through a UN Security Council resolution. And therefore there are people arguing that, oh, that's a New York priority. And here in Geneva, we have disarmament and other priorities. And so maybe we have an opportunity with this anniversary to actually pull together the work in New York and Geneva, and here in Geneva to pull together our thematic work. So it could be an opportunity, I think, for the Gender Champions Network as a whole here in Geneva to just look at it and see how we can use that anniversary to be much more integrated in our thematic approaches. Because even the having separate impact groups is very good, but maybe pulling the impact groups together to look at how the women, peace and security agenda can help us. And I think, as I say, again, just to conclude, that the COVID experience really maybe propels us or compels us to try and do that. So I think it's something that we were looking at in the Disarmament Impact Group as a big priority for this year. And of course, we've been thrown a little off course by our isolation, although we've seen now that we can work together. But I think we need to keep the challenge open, because, you know, in the second half of the year, we would often look to what's happening in New York, in UNGA, and in the various different assemblies here in Geneva. And that's all a little uncertain at the moment. So perhaps we do need to start thinking afresh as to how we can use the rest of the year and this anniversary a little more imaginatively.
I think that's a great idea. I have Martin, would you like to speak?
Yeah, I just want to reassure, thank you, Caitlin. I just want to reassure Renata that we've been thinking about this, and we had factored this into our activities intended to celebrate Beijing Plus 25. Now everything has been thrown into disarray, but we would be pleased, the IP would be pleased to link up with you, Renata, and other people to see how we can redesign our thinking in celebration of this very important anniversary that you raised. Women, peace and security is, of course, very central to today's conversation. If I could use the opportunity just to clarify again, Caitlin, that when we are talking about impact, we are not talking about what women bring to the table. I'm going back to representation. We are talking about what men and women can bring to the table when they work together, because I don't think that it is fair for us to ask women to justify why they have to be at the table, just as we have never, or almost never, asked men to justify why they should be at the table. I just wanted to clarify that point.
I think it's a great point. I've got to say, one of the things that I love, one of the many things I love a lot in this representation toolkit, is this asking at an assembly to have senior members, senior male members who have a tremendous amount of political clout and power from a member state to be gender champions for a particular assembly, so that you task somebody who has the power to reach out and bring others who maybe not have as much influence currently along with them. And I think that that's really fabulous best practice, which I actually think came from IPU, but it's really one of my favorite. And it's about, I think we all want to be asked to share, to include, but sometimes we don't know how. And we need to be gently explained exactly how to do it. So We have just a moment left, so I will take the prerogative of the chair and ask a question. The trade group had talked about the TPR, which is of course the Trade Periodic Review, and how now, which I didn't know, 70% of the people who have gone through that process have now put gender in their statements, which is quite, actually an extraordinary achievement. I've had a great, as women at the table now I speak, desire to link somehow the TPR and the UPR from the Human Rights Council, the Universal Periodic Review, with the Trade Periodic Review, which both deal with the same things, both deal with places that are both at two ends of one literal street, but actually are not connected at all. And just, Michael, to your point about maybe we can go through, erase our own boundaries between impact groups. I'm really curious to see how we might be able to thread the needle that way. Yep. Yes, please speak.
Sorry, I have to unmute. And now I've done something.
No, but you are unmuted.
No, I disappeared as well as unmuting. No, I mean, yes, in theory that would be, and as an ambitious project, that would be great. Bringing the WTO and the Human Rights Council to work together in any way effectively would be a great ambition. I've done a few TPRs and we do UPRs all the time. Yeah, it's something we should look at. There's too many barriers here in Geneva, far too many barriers here in Geneva. But one thing that strikes me, and it's a way possibly of avoiding that question. So let's think about how we would do that. But one thing that strikes me is for the trade group, we've got a process underway now for the reaching of a consensus on a new Director General of the WTO. And now that it's confirmed, perhaps to my relief, perhaps not, that there will not be an Irish candidate for that particular position, I'll be free to ask the group, how do you think you can effectively bring the gender perspective into that already difficult process? Now, I know there are some women candidates and others, but it would seem to be a great opportunity actually for the trade group coming up in the coming weeks and months.
Madam Tembo, can I? Sorry, don't have a vote either.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And I just wanted to come back on the point that Ambassador was just making reference to, which is how can we, looking at these two processes, try to bring them together. And I quite agree with him that, from a Geneva perspective, this perhaps should be much of a longer term issue. But I think what we need to do is to see how we can work towards sensitizing the countries at the country level to be able to take into account the two processes so that you're somewhat bringing the issues together. Because the second point is one has to look at what is it that really happens in the context of the trade policy review. This is an indication from countries in terms of the steps that, they've taken towards addressing gender issues. So you are basically informing, but not necessarily that you would be obliged to implement all that you have indicated in the trade policy review. So I would still say the focus must be on us making sure that we are concretizing more on the action side so that we are able to reflect a better quality rather than the quantity progressively going forward. Of course, where we can bring these processes together, that we can definitely try to do that. But I really would like to emphasize that it's at the end of the day, the measurement of our success will be what the countries actually do in very concrete terms that are measurable, and they are able to share in terms of the through the different reporting mechanisms that they have. And I just wanted to maybe come back briefly to the issue that was raised in relation to Renata's question. And here I think I absolutely agree with everybody that you know, that is suggesting that maybe we need to think through this and try to see how we can collectively come together, because I know the issue of gender equality is not one that relates only to human rights. It is also one that relates to growth, one that relates to stability. And in that context, from the Trade Impact Group, this becomes something that we can also see how we try to contribute on that particular occasion. I think the how is what we need to perhaps try to get together on and see how we can do this in an efficient and effective way.
All right. So I see that we're closing on our time. I know that we're going to continue our conversations offline about how, in this next opportunity we've been handed at the WTO, how do we get gender into the statements of all the candidates? When I opened, I said that's what happened actually at the WHO and actually at the WTO when the former DG ran unopposed. Also, it became part of a conversation. Perhaps we can inject it there and in every other sphere that we're operating in. I thank you all so much. I speak to many of you very, very often, but to see you all gathered together in this way and to hear the accomplishments that have happened over the last several years, it's beyond impressive. It's very moving, and in a time where we see that not everything is going necessarily in the most positive trend upwards, it's really wonderful to know that there's so many people who are devoting so much time, so much energy, so much brilliance, so much capital into just trying to make things a lot better and working together collaboratively. So I, from the bottom of my heart and from all gender champions to you, I say thank you very much. And we're going to leave our webinar exactly on time. So I shall say adieu. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a million.